Welcome to our backyard. This is the Backyard Philosophy Podcast. We are two friends having a discussion after everyone else has passed out or gone to bed. Grab a drink and listen as we discuss everything from automation, space exploration, and why the meaning of life is 42.
The metric system, football, and Speedos. Things America does not. But you know what America does and the rest of the world doesn't? Tipping. We're going to be talking about tipping today. And surprisingly enough, I did not know this. It's very uncommon to tip around the world. But it's completely normal here in America. But before we get into that, Nick, how are you doing? And what are you drinking?
I'm doing great. Drinking some American Prairie bourbon from High West Distilling. What are you drinking?
I am drinking a pina colada. I went kind of fancy because I've been drinking for a minute.
All right. Not what I was expecting.
I wish I had a waiter to give a tip to because, boy, this is a good pina colada. And that's right. We're going to be talking about tips. And, Nick, I got to say, tipping is a bit weird if you look at it as a whole planetary thing. Compared to the rest of the world, tipping is not normal. But before we get into modern society, we should give a little history of it. Tipping didn't come around till the late Middle Ages, though tipping has been recorded going back all the way to ancient China. There has been historical evidence for this, but it wasn't until the Middle Ages where you had more merchants and more tradesmen able to have more money than just royalty. As a show of prominence, they would tip when they go to restaurants, bars, taverns, etc., etc. The tip was kind of a show off. It was to show off and show their prominence. And that kind of continued. It kind of made people go, oh, well, he's rich. I should do that to show that I'm rich. And that kept going. And that quickly spread throughout Europe. If I remember correctly, medieval ages for tipping, I think it started in Southern Europe. I don't think it was a Northern Europe thing, but it quickly became one. Quickly spreading throughout Europe and became normalized. All the way up to the colonial ages. Tipping was quite a common practice to show a person's gratitude, to show a person's wealth, to simply kind of bribe someone. But America being America, we would have people travel to Europe, whether it be diplomats, rich people, just to see the old country, so to speak. And they tried bringing tipping over. They're like, oh, check out what the French and Italians are doing. And us Americans went, hell no. It's extremely unpatriotic, extremely not free to force people to tip and give away extra money that they don't need to. That's not democracy. That's not capitalism. But maybe, unfortunately, maybe not. We'll go into that later. America eventually adapted it. But I want to prevalent this. The way we adapted it, or the way the rest of the world kept going with it, is under much debate. Surprise, surprise, people weren't recording on how tipping got started or how tipping spread. It was kind of such a odd social structure that no one paid note to it. And the most prominent one that I saw was after the slaves were free, after the Civil War in America, a lot of former plantation owners still had their former slaves working land, but now they had to, quote unquote, pay them. So the loophole they were looking for that was to pay through tips. So not necessarily a salary, not necessarily a set rate. And through different segregations, other companies saw this. Nick, I think this is where you know a little bit more about the Pullman for the train stations, but it wasn't just a Southern practice, it was entire United States practice of using tips to pay people. You're like, oh, no, you're going to work this job for free. Don't worry, you'll make all your money on tips, which is still a thing that happens today and is under much debate.
Yeah, so tipping, it's weird because today we see it as a way of, paying someone for their time, as saying thanks, but originally it came as a way of screwing over people. And like Mike said, the history of tipping it's kind of hard. depending on what search you look at, there's a lot of different stories out there, but of how it got here and who was one of the first. But it's been around for a while. And like I said, the Pullman train car company, people go across the country in trains, and you had people in the cars that would provide meals, move baggage, all that kind of stuff. Well, the train car company figured out that they can make a lot of money if they didn't pay their employees.
Surprise! Free labor, aka slaves, makes you save more money.
So the people working there, working on the train car, the company made it known that they didn't get paid and had to be paid in tips. So they saved a lot of money by not having to pay salaries. And that way the people had to fend for themselves on the tips that they get, and company didn't have to pay them, didn't have to do, not that I don't know how much health insurance and stuff they had, but it was kind of just, they just got screwed over. And after that, it quickly spread to a lot of different businesses. And it seems like everyone wants to be, tipped these days. It started in train car attendants, and I saw some that I've never seen anyone do this, but some people say that you should tip your flight attendants. I've never seen anyone tip a flight attendant, but tipping's been a part of our country for a long time, and that's not true. Tipping's been a part of the world for historically small time, I guess, but for most of the modern history, the past couple hundred years at least. In America, we passed the minimum wage law, the Fair Labor and Standards Act in 1938, and that allowed states to set a lower wage for tipped workers. So, say if minimum wage was $5, then an employee who's also paid in tips could be paid a wage of $2.13, and then the rest would be made up in tips. And then if it wasn't made up to, if they didn't make enough in tips to hit the actual minimum wage, then the company would then have to pay to get the employee up to the minimum wage.
And as you can imagine, I want to prevalent this because we'll talk about it later in the podcast. This caused a lot of book bending, changing the books up because, well, you don't have to necessarily declare your tips. You don't have to necessarily say, oh, no, they got plenty of tips. We don't have to pay a minimum wage. But before we get away from the Civil War, the Pullman wasn't the only place doing it. Like Nick said, other places adapted it. Other places were doing it. A big one in major cities in the north were like elevator controlmen. Once elevators came around more in the 20th century, like this practice wasn't just a 1800s practice. It continued, and some would debate is still continuing. And for other words, with the bill being passed in the early 20th century, it's kind of now been recoined with the sub-minimal wage or sub-minimal wage salary, which is what I'll be calling it, Nick. I don't know if you're going to be calling the same thing. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page.
Nope, that works.
So this sub-minimum wage has been, well, the min of minimum wage, like Nick said, the $2.13, which is still in practice for many places today here in the United States, where I think the average American income is around $30,000, and there are still people getting paid $2.13 an hour, which is, well, that wage is not definitely accounting for inflation, that's for sure. But it wasn't until the 1990s where it was brought back to the table of new laws, new debates, and it kind of got changed to $4.25 in 1966, but only in 17 states. It wasn't a federal law, like what Nick was pointing out. The earlier law in the 20th century, it was a federal law. The minimum wage for the 17 states at $4.25 is more a state-by-state law. And that kind of brings us into the 20th century and the 21st century, and what I would count as modern sub-minimal wage. Unless you have some more stuff on history, Nick, I think we're all caught up on the weird, covered-up, gray history of tipping because, God, it was hard to find the history of tipping.
It really was. And, yeah, I just think it's crazy that tipping has, such a weird backstory.
For the rest of the world, it started off as a show of that you're rich. I got money, I can just throw away extra money. This meal cost 2 gold coins, I'm going to throw 3. I'm just that rich. And then people in America were like, we can use this to save ourselves money instead of use more money to show that we're rich, to save money so that we become more rich. So a real twisted history of tipping, but I think it's also important to note in the 20th century in the rest of the world, tipping kind of died off. I think the heyday of tipping in Europe, Asia, South America, was probably late 17th century, early 1800s. Now, that's kind of what I saw. I don't really have evidence to back that up, but for now, tipping isn't common in the rest of the world except for America.
Yeah, in some places it's frowned upon, like to leave a tip as an insult. In Japan, it's a no-go.
I did not know that. I'll be honest, I probably would have tipped in Japan unless you told me that.
Luckily, it doesn't seem like Japan is on your travel list coming up, so I don't think I really saved you that much.
In the near future. But tipping, a lot of people survive off tipping. As I mean, as now, millions upon millions of people live off tips. I mean, it's a scary number, and the need to tip has been so ingrained into our society that we think it's normal to tip. I don't know. This is getting kind of off topic, but to me, Nick, tipping. Well, I'm gonna save that later for the podcast. Later in the podcast, but right now there are about 6 million people in the United States that work for tips as of 2021. That's a lot of people that are solely surviving off tips. And well, here's a tip for you, Nick. Get it? Uh, if you want to have a good quality of life, working for tips is kind of a risky gamble. Now, don't get me wrong. I came across interesting stories where people were making 60,000 to 120,000 a year, but they're the outliers. The average living wages that people who work for tips get is not very high, and their income is very low. Would you agree with that, Nick?
Yeah, that seems right.
And like we mentioned with books, in 2018, $42.8 million of back wages for over 41,000 different employees were paid because of they didn't get the tips or the minimum wage they were promised. Like Nick mentioned, if you don't make your min wage with tips, the company's supposed to pay you back. Well, it's a cash business usually with tips, so it's easy to hide the information and fudge the books. And $42 million is a lot of money, especially when it's only like 6 million people that are working for tips in the United States. It just makes me think of how many more people are getting screwed over.
Well, it's basically incentivizing each of those people to distrust the other one, right? Because the restaurant owner needs to know how much tips the other their workers are getting, right? But if the other person discloses all their tips, then they have to pay the taxes on those tips. But if you only disclose a portion of it, you don't only have to pay on that. So there's an incentive for the servers or whoever's receiving the tips to underreport, and an incentive for the restaurant owner or whatever business owner to, I guess, report an accurate number or an over number so they don't have to make up the difference. So it just seems like right away those two people are working against each other.
I don't know why, but it reminds me of like the proverb or story of where you have 10 people in a village and one person's a liar and it just destroys the village. Like you just need one person to be dishonest in the situation and the entire thing crumbles. It's almost like a house of cards, if I would say so, Nick.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the sole factor. I'm sure there's a lot of other factors, but the restaurant industry has a pretty high turnover.
Oh, yes. The changing of jobs, the switching to different careers that are in the same field. Like the amount of times when researching this that I saw people who would go from bartending to taxi drivers to waiters and waitresses was amazing. It was almost like interchangeable positions but it was all heavily tip based. Though I don't know, do taxis even exist anymore? I'll be honest.
They do. We have them here in Oregon because the state wants them to ensure for higher than Uber wants to pay insurance. So we only have Uber in like certain counties that are allowing to do it. So we have a taxi service in town.
That is really weird.
It is really weird. It'd be sweet if we had Uber or Lyft, whatever, anything.
Anything besides a taxi system. But I also want to point this out. More than majority of the time, when you are working for subminimum wage, the 213, the 425, those positions usually don't offer paid vacation, health insurance, sick leave. It's just outright even rare in just the restaurant industry, let alone just tipping industries. And for minimum wage, the current minimum wage in the United States, it's not exactly common, but it's still more prevalent by far than in restaurants. And Nick, it is amazing how that turn door of a door that they have for waiters and waitresses, like how quickly people come and go as for serving. It's and I can't even imagine how COVID's affect that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like most people knew this. I mean, most people know someone who worked in the service industry, and it's usually if you had one job in the service industry, you had a few. You didn't just work at one restaurant, you worked at a few. At least the people I know. So I feel like that's fairly common. And it's kind of like being a vegan, you know, people in the service industry have to tell you about it. And then they make you, not make you, not kind of, they always like, yeah, you have to tip. You don't know what these people go through on a day-to-day basis. It's like, all right, cool.
You don't know what I go through on a day-to-day basis. It is interesting. This might be kind of skipping around, but when I worked as a cashier, I don't really know other way to say that, we weren't allowed to take tips. Like, because I wasn't working just cashiers, I was kind of working sales. We weren't allowed to take tips. Were forced to decline taking tips, which kind of sucked because I would have made a lot of money because I can put on a big smile and be happy even when I'm not, which is really weird. But granted, I wasn't getting paid subminimum wage, so there is that.
Yeah. And, I mean, don't get me wrong. I like getting tips. I worked for a company, and we'd help people load heavy shit into their trailers and cars and stuff, and occasionally we'd get tips. Not very often. It wasn't expected, but it was nice. Extra money, a little extra money never hurt, but I wasn't relying on tips, so didn't have to report them.
So, Nick, you like just the tip?
I like the whole thing.
I'm sorry. I'm such a little kid. But you know what was surprising when researching this, Nick? Do you know what the age demographic is for the best tippers are?
Millennials are the best tippers.
Damn straight. 25 to 34-year-olds are the best tippers in the United States. I would have guessed it would have been 40-plus-year-old. But apparently, senior citizens are the skimpiest when it comes to tipping, which is kind of weird because I always associate young people with being assholes.
Yeah, it's weird because the other thing I came across too is that young people are known for being bad tippers. Now, I did see Gen Z, they tip about 18%, which is the same as Gen X. So I don't know if Gen Z's dragging us down.
I don't know, but I can tell you that for millennials, it's usually about 20 to 22%.
You know what else was interesting about that? Do you know what age group has the biggest aversion to tipping?
Senior citizens?
No, millennials.
Really?
Yep. Said, is it like a Gallup poll or something? But I have it right here. Millennials have the largest aversion to tipping. And they asked if they'd be more willing to pay more for meals if tipping were abolished. Millennials were the most likely to say yes.
I mean, I'm on that boat, but that's very surprising to me. And since we're talking about...
I think it is because, like we were talking about it, I think a lot of us know someone who served, and it's always this, like, when I say served, I mean served in the restaurant industry, who served food. A lot of us know someone who served food. And they always make this whole thing about tipping, and it's like, to me, like it's like it went from, a standard tip is like what, 16%. Now it's like your standard is supposed to be 20 and you have to tip more. And everyone's always like, you have to tip. Don't, like, I hate people who don't tip. And so I think it's this thing. It's like tipping is expected of us, even if we don't like the service. And so we just think it's all kind of bullshit.
It's weird too. A study done in 2018, the amount of people that you need to tip in like the world, like just like your everyday life, not just waiters and waitresses, has increased from 2 years earlier from that. So it keeps increasing the amount of people you need to tip. It keeps increasing the amount of people who work for tips, or it's custom to tip them. One that I make no sense to me is service people in bathrooms. I can grab my own towel. I don't need a person to do that for me. I don't understand why there's a person paid to stand in the bathroom and hand out mint scum, and that's confusing as hell to me.
Yeah, if we could just do away with that whole thing, that'd be fine. I think the tipping is getting out of hand. Like you said, there's so many people you have to tip. Like, if you're going on a trip or something, you stay in a hotel and you take a shuttle to the airport, you got to tip your driver, and then you got to tip them. You feel obligated if they lift your bag out of the car. It's like, man, I could do that. Like, I'd rather do that and keep the $2, And then, yeah, it's like everyone's like gives you that look like they're expecting a tip, and it's like, man, you drove me for 5 minutes, and I picked up my own bag. It's like, here you go. I'm never gonna see you again. But what are you gonna do?
It is weird too how many apps that you use for people force you to tip. Like you have to choose 5, 10, 20% or other. Like it doesn't allow you to do zero, or maybe it does it zero if you hit other and stuff like that. But they make it kind of harder to do because, well, a lot of those people are ready for tips. But it's weird, Nick. Could you take a guess if you were to divide the United States into four parts, the North, the South, the East, and the West, who would you think are the best tippers and worst tippers?
That's like a weird way to divide up the
All right,
country, but I'm
Midwest,
gonna say
East Coast, West Coast, the South.
okay. I'm gonna go with Midwest best tippers, West worst tippers, no, East worst tippers, and South okay. I don't know. What's the ranking?
So this is another predicament like the hemp episode we did. We should go check out Backyard Philosophy, where they're skewing the data to help promote whatever side that they're on. So statistically, West Coast tippers are the worst tippers, but West Coast have the tendency to have minimal wage instead of subminimal wage. So there's less people to tip and it's less common. East Coast has more subtypical workers, so they have to tip more and it's more common to tip. The Midwest is, depending on where you are, always first or second. It tends to be the Midwest or South tend to be the best tippers. East Coast tend to be the most common tippers, which kind of explains why they're not always the best tippers because they do it so often. So it kind of, how you turn the story is how good of tippers people are. But to me, Nick, the Midwest and South just kind of makes sense to me. Midwest, the friendly people. South, the hospitality. And also, I feel like there's a lot more poor people in the Midwest and South, so we understand working for tips. We understand a little few bucks here and there can actually really help.
Yeah, we're talking about appropriate tips by income. That the basically, uh, what's it called? If you make between 30 to 74,000, you're more likely to tip like 15%. But if you and then, if you make less than that, you're still most likely to tip 15%, but or lower. When you make 75,000, you're more likely to tip 20% or more. So it also separated a little bit by income of the more, I mean, this shouldn't surprise anyone. The more money you make, the bigger tips you leave. So it could be, I mean, where's most of the wealth at? I guess most of the wealth would probably be in New York and California, which were some
New York and
not
Texas.
the best tipping areas. Okay, of course, You had to bring Texas into this, but New York, Texas, California.
Don't know about California anymore. It's kind of a mass exodus, but New York has the number one amount of billionaires, followed by Dallas Fort Worth area. So it's those are the two biggest billionaire cities in the world. So I imagine there's those people are probably leaving the bigger tips.
But what's funny is once you get into the 75,000 or more, 49% of that bracket was likely to leave a 20% tip or more. But then it drops substantially, so very few in that bracket would leave a 16 to 19% tip, and then very few would leave a less than 15. Whereas compared to, I guess, it's about the same.
I do have a question though. Is it people do 20 and 15% more just like on average than like 16, 17%? Simply because a lot of people are bad at math and don't want to do the percentages in between. I mean, because there are entire apps dedicated to calculating what tip should I give this person. Because I don't know about you, Nick, but when I was a kid, I was taught move the decimal over once and times it by 2.
Yep. Yeah, I use my phone because I'm not good at math. But so the same as Gallup poll. Generally speaking, what percent of a restaurant bill do you think is an appropriate tip? 20% tip. 34% of people said is an appropriate tip, and 15%, 37% is an appropriate tip, compared to 15% said less than 15, only 2% said more than 20, and 16 to 19 was also 6%. So basically your 15 and your 20, those are your two big numbers of anything that gets broken down. It's somewhere along those two lines. That's where people are at. And I think we're moving up because right in the past wasn't like 15% or 10% was the standard, 15% was a good tip. Now 15% is kind of the standard, and that 20% was a good tip. But I feel like we're in the gray area where 20% is what people expect now, and over that is a good tip.
Oh, yes. I completely remember being 18% is a good tip. If you want to leave someone a good tip, 18%. If you want to leave something because it was service, you leave 10%. And if it was average, you left 15. That's what I remember as a kid. But nowadays, it's 20%. And it is interesting to me, too, also the type of restaurant, because I don't expect you to know this, Nick, but I imagine that percentage heavily changes whether if you have to make a reserve for the restaurant. I imagine the tips are much larger percentage compared to like an IHOP. Sorry, IHOP, don't mean to pick on you, but I mean, it's depending on the restaurant, I imagine has to heavily affect. Like if I went to like a truck diner stop where it's like $5 for a meal, I'm probably going to tip more because I know the person's probably unwealthy. But if it's like an average restaurant where it's like a steakhouse, I'm probably going to try to tip averagely. But if it's a nice restaurant, like I could take a date out to like a suit and tie restaurant, I'm probably going to tip closer to 30%, depending on, because usually those services to me have always been highly sought after. Like they go always above and beyond.
Yeah, and it's funny that you talk about tipping in relation to the place that you're at, because I found that tipping really wasn't related to the service as much as it was other factors. Like you're talking about the experience, the location, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would say there's maybe a handful, if that, of servers who've actually like gone above and beyond. Like it actually wowed me. Usually, like a server's like, "Oh, that person was nice," and then 5 minutes later, completely forget they even exist. To be actually the grand titan of a server is very hard to do, and I would say they're far and few in between.
Yeah, and so it's kind of weird that this whole, I mean, when everyone thinks of tipping, we think about the service and how good was the service, but very little of times it comes into effect. Most of the time we're going to tip in relation to, like you said, where are we at, what's kind of the area. Occasionally the service will come into it if it's really good or really bad, but for the most part, service doesn't really play a part. And we think of tipping as a way to get service, like to get good service, guarantee that we get our food on time, stuff like that, is like an incentive program. But if we don't pay based on the fact that it's an incentive program, if we just pay based on something else, we're really not providing an incentive.
Yeah, it's almost like foul tipping. Huh. Get it, Nick? Get it? uh,
Unfortunately, yeah.
I am also curious too with the restaurant industry because if I see the busboy coming, I'll leave a tip. So I'm very curious on how the tips are divided. Like, do they actually pull together? Do people just keep it for themselves? Is there greed involved, selfishness involved? Because there's again a lot of money is getting thrown around. A lot of people are changing how much they're actually making, how much their employees are making. I kind of feel much better tipping a person cleaning tables than I do a waiter or waitress because you interact with the waiter and waitresses. You never interact with the busboy. Does that make sense to you, or is that just me being crazy?
No, I think that's reasonable. And the sharing tips and when you tip, where does it go? That's like it depends on the restaurant. It's very controversial. Some places share, some places don't. People get in fights. It's a good time. Um, but yeah, no, I think that's most people want to tip like the busboy because the busboys and the kitchen staff never get tips and sometimes get paid like the tip amount, so they have to share. They'll get like a portion of the tips or something, but yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I mean, it's who's working harder, right? I mean, that's kind of how you're looking at it. Of is the guy in the back in the hot kitchen working as hard as the person bringing your food? I mean, I know which one I'd rather do, and I hate people, but
You beat me too. I was gonna say the same thing. I'm always a sucker for the unsung hero, and uh, by no means are people in the restaurant industry heroes. But let's be honest, being on your feet all day, taking people's customers' orders, it's not fun. It's not a fun job. But being in a hot kitchen, cooking lots of food really rapidly, people yelling, screaming, might get burned. It's almost like hazard pay almost. But yet
not speaking the same language.
oh God, yeah, that's always fun when you have a Croatian and a Mexican next to you and you're trying to speak Spanish and Croatian at the same time, trying to figure out what order they need. That's a fun fucking time. But yeah, it's yeah, I the service people have always been up front. The people, the hoster, the hostess, the bartender, the bartendess, the blah 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 blah. They're always up front. They're the people person. I imagine they make far more tips. Like at a bar, you always see the bartender getting tipped, but you don't see the guy carrying the kegs up the stairs to get it to fresh up the beer. Or the bouncer. I doubt a bouncer's ever gotten a tip ever in history where they're, having to deal with drunk assholes on a nightly basis. That's gotta suck. And I guarantee you, like, they're not getting tipped for that job. And I would be very surprised if they get paid more than the bartender, and the bartender is making a lot of money on tips. It's just, I don't know. I always have a soft spot for the unsung hero.
Yep, which is why some restaurants have chosen to not do tipping at all. Just go away from tipping and just have a higher price for food on the menu, and that's the initial higher price that you pay. You don't have to worry about tipping, and that gets distributed equally to all the employees instead of one type of employee receiving all the tips.
which makes which makes so much more sense to me. Actually, some speaking of the East Coast being more tippers, some things are changing. Granted, this was met with a lot of controversy. Nick, I don't know if you came across the uh, Intuitive 77 in DC. I don't know if you came across that.
I don't know specifically, but go ahead.
This is a
Let you know.
this is a bill in the Northeast that was passed, I believe, and it kind of changed the local subminimum wage. And by 2026, it has to increase. And it was amazing on how many people fought it. Now, granted, the restaurant business isn't exactly a rich man's business. It's kind of hard to become successful in that, and a lot of restaurants are, well, they wouldn't survive if they had to pay their employees full minimum wage, which is weird to think about. So a lot of people are fighting that. And there are more bills being added to the table of changing that. And I thought that was very interesting that within the next 5 years, Nick, more bills are going to be added to the table, which completely change the tipping industry.
Yeah, and it's like we mentioned previously, the 213 minimum wage in 1938 sub minimum wage has never been adjusted for inflation, cost of living, or anything. So at the time is much higher. It's essentially only gotten down because of inflation. 213 in 1938 was a lot more than 213 today.
Yeah, I would say so, Nick. I'm trying to think what I could even buy. I don't think 213 would even buy me a gallon of gas nowadays.
If you can't buy you a gallon of gas in Texas, you don't even want to know how much gas it'll get you over here.
Oh God, I don't want a teaspoon of gas. God, yeah, 213 is just. I don't know how that bill was written where it wasn't allowed for to change to grow with the times. It seems very weird to me. But before we get too far away from the bartenders,
Wait a minute. Government being out of touch?
uh,
What?
Nick, what if I were to tell you that the tipping industry is a little bit racist and probably sexist?
I'd say you're right,
Oh,
but it's an odd in the way you think. It's not the way you think.
I don't know. For some reason, I just thought tipping would be equal across the board, but apparently I'm wrong. So in America, it is I think it's 30% if you're a person of color to get the same tip as a person as white, which is weird. And women make far more money in tips than men do, and I'll get to that in a second. But
I mean, that's not surprising.
well, it's not surprising in a minute, but I want to explain it because I want to talk about boobies. Uh, but it's also, unfortunately, as I just said that comment, women are far more sexually harassed or get asked to do strange things for tips. It's kind of disgusting, but it does happen quite often. But for women making more tips, well, whether we live in the 21st century or the 50s, apparently it's men like hot girls. And if a girl, the psychology of it, again, you can check out our sources on YouTube, but
Look at us bringing you breaking news.
using your physical attractiveness or some cues on the dumb human male brain, you're able to get a lot more in tips. So like the psychology of manipulating your people you're serving is a whole science of how to get more tips. Like you've probably seen the memes or pictures of Apple versus Android tip, which one you like better. Like that actually works. Or a person wearing a more low cut shirt who will actually work. A person who like touches you on your shoulder, you're like you have a chance of getting a 5% increase in your tip. Like there's a whole science and not behind it.
Saw that too, but I was like, man, that's weird to me. I don't want some random person to touch me. But I saw that multiple times that was true. Like if the server touches you, they'll get a larger tip.
That's probably at Hooters. Let's be honest here.
That'd be hilarious. We did this study at Hooters, and we found out the more the women touch the men, the higher they tip. That is not even the dumbest scientific article I would have read.
That's probably what actually happened, which is the sad part. But I'm with you, Nick. I like machines and animals. Humans aren't really that close to that top of that list. So just leave me alone. Pretty much is just give me my food, make sure my water is already full, and leave me alone. That's pretty much how I like to be at restaurants. So if someone touching my shoulder and being like extra talkative, it's like I got food in my mouth. Leave me alone. So that's to me annoying, but I guess to everyone else in the world, Nick, people like being touched while they eat their food.
Yeah, I don't get that one.
Yeah, but it is amazing on the psychology of tipping, because I don't know about you, Nick, but to me, I feel like I should only tip if the person went above and beyond. Like if they put in a hard day's work and like I've worked construction. I've had to work with like, painters. And I've seen painters that have to come into whatever facility we're working on and just spend the extra hour getting every detail, every prep right. And I would see my boss tip them a little extra because they do good quality work. And to me, that makes sense for tipping. But like, I don't know, you're serving me coffee. Why do I have to tip you? It doesn't, that seems so foreign to me.
Yeah, and I think that's what tipping it's gotten out of control, right? Like we said, there's so many people to tip. Like if you stay in a hotel, you're supposed to tip the people who clean your room, the people who bring your bags up. If you can't carry your bags up by yourself for whatever reason, the people who check in, the people who drive you to the hotel, it's like it just never ends. And if you go out to eat, you're supposed to tip that person. If you ask the person where to eat, you're supposed to tip them. It's like, and then you have to tip your Uber there. It's like it's when tipping is expected, it's not a tip. It's just another tax. And if tipping is like what you're saying of, wow, you really did a good job, here's some extra money, thanks for the quality of work, that makes sense to me. But I feel like right now in the United States, tipping is another tax. If it's expected, it's not a tip, right? Like like we are saying, the expected tip is 16%. So if you're expecting 16%, that's a tax. When waiters complain that they didn't get any tip or something, well, I mean, yeah, most people you're supposed to tip, but if you're supposed to tip, again, that's not a tip. So I would like to go back to that. I hate how you're expected to tip like 20%. And if you don't tip, everyone's like, dude, you have to tip. Like, it's rude. It's like, well, the service was shit. What are you going to do?
Yeah, no taxation without equal representation. And there's no representation of, hey, we should just pay people just to do their job and not have to tip above on that too. Like, an example for this is my grandmother. She hired someone to cut her grass because you can't cut her own grass. But this person didn't just cut the grass. He also pruned the trees, he pulled the weeds, and he didn't expect a tip. He just did it all for the same price of cutting the grass. And she tipped him heavily. I mean, when you did far more yard work than you were previously asked or paid to do, and you did, good work and made her life easier, yeah, that's when you should tip. But like the whole society structure, the society bias, the society basis of leaving a tip, it's not right. A tip is a bonus, and you're making it not a bonus. You're, like you said, I think that's a representation of it's an extra tax. So not only are you getting taxed whatever you purchased on, you're getting taxed again by guilt, by society pressure. I'm not quite sure the right category for that.
Peer pressure?
I guess society norm? I'm not sure. But before we get too far away from it, I do want to point out, I understand a lot of businesses would not survive if they had to pay minimal wage. If the subminimum wage allows them to hire more people, to have the quote-unquote quality service. I understand that, but it seems like it's a duct tape fix to a broken system. Would you agree with that, Nick?
Yeah. And what I would like to see is like like if you go on Yelp and it's like one of those things. It's like, dine, like where they have those options that everyone looks for, like, do they serve alcohol here? Can you sit outside? Is this a tipping, or is tipping built into the menu so you can just look and know? Because, and this is one of the things with the no tipping, at least for restaurants, the price of their food is higher. Now, that's not true. The price of their food is the same. The cost of your meal stays the same, but the price on the menu is higher because the tip is built in. So when someone just looks at the menu, they're less likely to go to that restaurant. When you go to the one next door, the prices are a few bucks cheaper. Well, that's the price of your tip. And so these companies need a way to be able to advertise that the tip is built in. And so they're serving the same price, right? It's just that we look and say, oh, like a $12 burger, we're not counting the 20% tip millennials are probably going to pay. So they need a way to be able to get that information out there. Now, I don't know how you do that without someone helping you. Or, yeah, and then if you do raise prices, then you face the risk of having less people come to the restaurant because prices are higher. There's a certain amount that people can afford to spend on food, and if it gets too expensive, they can't go out to eat. So this is it's not a win-win situation. It's kind of like a lose-lose situation. We can continue with the current shitty broken system we have, or we can try and change, and a bunch of restaurants might go out of business. I mean, we don't know.
I mean, so many restaurants are out of business now. I mean, what's the worst of
Yeah, no
risking
time like the present, you know.
it? No, I agree. It's a broken system, and you might as well, if it's already broken, might as well break it all the way and try to actually fix it. Sometimes you got to start from the ground up, and unfortunately, to make an omelet, you got to crack a few eggs, and it would suck for a lot of people. And to answer your question, Nick, on how we integrate that, I just say you make it like, how by law you have to show what ingredients are in it so people with allergies can know what's inside your food. Just put it at the top if it's a non-tipping restaurant or a tipping restaurant. And here's the thing. If people are dumb and don't actually read, they'll actually tip, so the business will make more money. If they're smart and they actually read, they go, oh, okay, I don't have to tip here. So the people who actually read would benefit from it. And I think those people should always get more benefit, the people who take the time to actually read or figure out what's going on.
Yep. And here's the other thing too. So you have a no tipping restaurant. And what happens like when you tip? Essentially you just raise the price for everything, right? Like, now hopefully in an ideal world at the no tipping restaurants, you only tip if it's like exceptional service, kind of like what we were talking about of going above and beyond. But I feel like it's going to be the servers will be paid a higher minimum wage, and eventually we might start expecting a tip again, unless there's like some big social movement against tipping, because like we said, tipping does have a weird history, and so it might be the next thing to get canceled. I don't know.
Well, I do think it actually is kind of moving forward towards canceling, especially with AI automation in like different countries like Japan that have robotic servers. It's a job that's getting replaced by automation, so you don't necessarily need to tip a robot.
Yeah, that's very true. That there's no reason to just build it on the menu.
And Nick, since we're still talking about modern tipping before we get into robots, tipping at bars, or not just bars, but low price items. I don't understand why that's a norm to tip at a low price item. If something costs $4, I don't think I should have to tip. Now, granted, what I normally do when I go to the bars is my first round of drinks, I tip very high, and then I make sure the bartender sees it, so when they see me come back, they come and serve me first because they think I tip high always. Granted, it's kind of a dirty trick, but it's effective. But, Nick, what's your opinion on when something costs low, like under $10, do you tip? Like, to me, it doesn't make sense to tip when something's that low.
I'd only tip in that scenario if I know the food is going to be really good. So, like, I hate tipping for, like, if I'm going to go get, like, one drink or something at a bar, it's like $9.50. I'll slide across the buck. But it almost feels more of an insult to tip $1, you know? It's like $1. I know it's like $1 a drink is standard, but it's almost like, I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I'm like, man, that's such like a ripoff. But yeah, I mean, everyone knows you tip well at your favorite bar. That's just the way it is. But so if I'm going, like, there's this taco place by me, and it's in like kind of a convenience store. It's like, it's kind of sketchy just because you don't think it's in a place that's going to have great tacos. And they have like that keypad thing where it has like the tips on it. And I'll tip like the 10% or whatever, like the minimum, just because I know that there's a lot of weird people in our area and these people have to deal with them, and their food is really good. So I feel bad just of like the people they have to deal with on a daily basis. Like, yeah, I'm not going to get into it, but so for that kind of stuff, like, and again, I can't stress how good these tacos are. Yeah, I'll tip extra there because I know it's really good. But if I'm going, like, I'm going to grab, like, a coffee or something for my wife, and I run into the store for like $5 and they make me a coffee and they're like, okay. And they're looking at me for a tip. I'm like, no, not, I don't care.
I'll be honest, I'm completely biased. I always tip heavy at my favorite restaurants, or I tip at a restaurant that I might not go to often, but I want to make sure they never go out of business. I know my extra like few bucks is not going to help really at all, but it's like just my subconscious goes, okay, I'm adding more money to their table because one, I don't want this to go away because their food's really really good, and I don't want them to disappear.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I know we don't really talk about it, but I think during, not that we're avoiding it, but tipping during COVID, I tip way more during COVID than I ever have. We went to a restaurant like right at the very beginning, like right before the 2 week lockdown, and I think we tipped like 50% or something. Like it was insane. I've never tipped that much. Like some restaurant by us, and then I'd tip for like when we're doing takeout or something. We left like a good tip or pick up and shit. Like we don't even normally. I would never tip if I'm coming to a restaurant and picking up the food, but I think right now everyone's tipping a lot. And I didn't really come across anything to say that tipping was up, but I feel like it is.
So I'll be honest with you, I've been kind of doing the opposite. So once the lockdowns happened, I tipped high because I felt like, oh, I'll help out people, the businesses, make sure they last through. But because so many different companies and so many different industries are pretty much forcing me to tip, it's making me tip lower because I know I have to tip this person, this person, this person, this person. So my normal 20% tip quickly diminished to like 5% because, well, I got to tip the driver, I got to tip the restaurant, I got to tip blah, I got to tip Z, I got to tip everything. And it just makes me want to tip less money. And when I can, tip not at all because it's almost like trying to squeeze blood from stone. But that just
It's
might
a
be me.
tax you can choose not to pay.
What?
It's a tax that you can finally choose not to pay.
Oh, that's I can choose where my taxes go. It's quite nice. Which is like it's like what every country should do. You should have your choose where your taxes go. But that's another story for another time. But you mentioned Nick that you don't tip for $5, but you tip for like your taco joint. Is the taco joint more cheap food? Because I don't think
Yeah, it's like $5 for like two tacos.
so. That sounds heavenly because it sounds like I'd order like 30 tacos. But I guess I kind of get that. I guess also too. I imagine subconsciously, and I imagine this is a statistic I'm pulling over my ass, but I imagine majority of the people prefer to tip mom and pop shops compared to big industries. Like not to pick on anyone, but like say Outback Steakhouse. I imagine tips there are less than tips at a mom and pop place. What's your opinion on that?
I feel like that's pretty true. I know we don't really have too many chain restaurants out here besides your normal like McDonald's and Dairy Queen. But yeah, I think we have a lot of we when we eat, it's usually just because we don't have like chain restaurants because we live in a somewhat small town that every restaurant's kind of like a mom and pop restaurant, so we'll tip more just because.
They're your neighbors,
And
pretty
it's
much.
yeah, they're your neighbors, and it's I guess I wonder if that's a part of it too. Like on Facebook, like during COVID, our whole county was like we have like a county-ish Facebook page, I guess, that everyone posts everything to, of like what's happening in the county, and all the restaurants would be like, okay, like guys, like we need help or something, like this is what we're doing, like come blah blah blah, and everyone would come and like help them out. So it was more like a community act than like I don't know, than maybe than like you're saying like a chain restaurant where if someone's like, "Come help support your local McDonald's," you're like, "All right, guy, fuck off." Like, I don't care. My local McDonald's is gonna be fine.
Yeah, yeah. And hell, even if they're not finding that local area, they die, they might leave room for a mom and pop shop to pop up. Just saying. It's I don't know. It's just I don't know about you, Nick, but when researching this, it made me think on how I tip and who I tip and why I tip. It's I completely agree with your statement where you don't really tip on the service, you kind of tip on the atmosphere or like the society basis. And it also makes me realize that the different situations on how you're supposed to tip. Like some tips now in the digital age are solely on your phone with cash apps, but some tips you have to do cash only still. It's just weird how there's this entire art structure, this entire skill set of the right way to tip.
So I'm just going to read real quick for you, Mike. You might enjoy this. There's 8 factors that are shown to influence the participants' tipping habits. Type of restaurant, like you said, cleanliness of restaurant, atmosphere of restaurant, friendliness of the server, server gender, quality of service, quality of food, and size of bill. These factors account for 80% of the tipping decisions for almost half of the study participants. Basically, just like the restaurant and the atmosphere and the food account for most of the tipping decisions. Like the service really isn't in there. I mean, you had the friendliness of the server, but that was about it. I don't know. It's just if our decision is made up before you get the service, we're not tipping on the service, I guess is the point.
Hence why we should just switch to robots. We don't have to deal with human beings. They'll never mess up our order, and we don't have to tip them. It seems like a win-win to me, Nick.
Yeah, that's true. It
And
would be, I mean, places are doing it already.
and here's a tip for you, Nick. It would make probably food taste even better. But that's a whole another conversation for another time. Having robots cook your food, but just a little tip for you, Nick.
Yep, we knew this was coming.
Why you don't like my little tongue-in-cheek puns?
What? That is ridiculous. I am a huge fan, and I have told you that every chance I get.
Oh, well, here's a tip, ladies and gentlemen. You should definitely send all your puns to Nick.
I'll edit this one.
No. But out of curiosity, Nick, what's the weirdest? This is a kind of an odd question, kind of out of left field, but what's the weirdest situation you've had to tip?
I think we tipped our like wedding planner
What?
and our pilots.
All right, the pilot makes sense to me for some reason, but the wedding planner?
Yeah, I think so. Grant, yeah, that was probably the weirdest one I've tipped. But it's more of just like the every single one person who expects a tip for like mediocre service. It's like the wedding planner, she did a great job, so I didn't mind tipping her. But it was more like I'm more upset at like the people who it's like bring like your food late and it's cold and then they're just like looking at you all pissed off like where's my tip? It's like what do you mean? Like this is like some of the worst service I've ever received. I'm not going to give you a tip. I mean in that case like I even feel obligated to give like a 10% tip, but it's just like they're still upset and it's like why though?
I can make you cringe. You know what my worst tipping story is?
I do not.
I was either in Detroit or Minneapolis, and I was in a parking garage, and it was one of those tendons where you give your stub so you can get out, and they just lift up the gate for you. And they were waiting for a tip first before they lift the gate to let me out. And it was like a long 30 seconds before he realized that I'm not going to tip him for pushing a button to open a door to let me out.
That literally seems like a tax.
I was like, no, I already paid the $10 to stay here for like 8 hours. Let me go. And it was just like an awkward pause of us just staring at each other. No one was saying a thing, and he was just like waiting. Like I felt like his hand was ready to reach out for money if I was going to give it to him. But I'm like, I'm not giving you a couple bucks for literally pressing a red button, which is your job that you're getting paid for.
Yeah. No, That's a tax. If you can't use if you can't use a road without paying for it, that's literally a tax, right? You've already paid for the service. You've already paid for getting in and out. But if you can't pay this additional guy, I mean that's almost like bribery.
It really felt like I was getting muscled real quickly. It was really annoying. And something that I found kind of interesting, and we might touch on
Oh,
a different.
I got one more good one.
Oh, you got
We
another
were
good
in
one.
we were in Ohio, and the place we were going, you had to valet your car. And so even though there was like parking, there's like you had to valet. And so it's like you don't want to tip because you could have just parked your car this other place for cheaper, but you have to do the valet. And so then you have to tip the valet after you pay for the valet. It's like, you fuckers.
I'll be honest. There was a date I went on once. It was an expensive date. I was in high school or early ages college, so I didn't have exactly a lot of money at the time. And a major concern for me was, do I will I have enough money to tip the valet when this date is over? That was like an actual major concern for me, which doesn't seem right. But something that also seems kind of weird, but it kind of makes sense for tipping is strippers. It kind of makes sense that majority of their money comes from tipping, not from salary based. Because I'll be honest, I am not enstewed in strippers, so I don't know how their revenue system works. But I imagine tips are a large involvement in their revenue source.
Yeah, well, to get around most of the legal code, I think most of the strippers are like models or artists, and so you pay them per. I said artists, Mike. I'm not sure if you understood that.
You are
And
the
so
expert in
essentially,
it, so I mean, I'll bow to that knowledge.
it's all to get around like the legal code, except in Nevada where anything goes because it's Nevada, except inside Las Vegas city limits and Reno city limits. But other than that, yeah. But that seems more like that's just like the way it is. I don't know. I don't know if that would work salary, that business model.
Yeah, I think that one we just leave as tips being the major business because it's you get I guess in a way is thinking you get tips on how good you are at your job, aka how hot you are and how X amount you dance. Not quite sure how to phrase that, but yeah, tipping doesn't that industry I don't think should ever change, or I don't think it can change. But like the restaurant industry, the bartending industry, I think that could all easily change with tipping.
Well, yeah, I mean, the restaurant industry, your service is built in. Now, unless they wanted to go to like a per hour where you go into the strip club and you pay X amount and you get to spend however many hours in there, and then if you purchase a dance, that's X amount of dollars more. Then I could kind of see that, but I think just like if you look at movies and just American culture, strip clubs are just such a part of, and throwing a dollar on the stage is just such a part of, I mean, American culture. Like you see it in movie after movie after movie. That to get rid of it would people would be genuinely pissed off.
I'll be honest, I agree with you, but it also is very weird to me that throwing your money at a stripper or putting it in their speedos or panties, they would be angry if we stop doing that. I guess that comes back to the tipping and touch, Nick. I guess people who get touched more tip more. So I guess vice versa. The more you
So we thought it was at a Hooters, but it was actually at a strip club.
that is the best scientific survey ever. But maybe people just crave human touch.
The Bada Bing, is that the one from Sopranos?
But I guess people crave human touch so much that they're willing to pay extra to do it.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the point of strip clubs, right?
Yeah, you're asking
Am
the
I
wrong
mistaken
person.
somewhere?
Strip clubs don't make sense to me. It seems like you're paying a lot of money to get teased. But moving away from strip clubs, where do you think the future of tipping is going?
Ideally, I'd like to see it go away, and I'd like to see it revert back to like what you were talking about. Of if someone goes above and beyond, here you go. Like at the end of my planting season, after working with my guys all year, I'll buy them a case of beer if they do a good job as a thank you. I'd be like, hey, you did a good job, which made my life a little bit easier. Enjoy this case of beer. It's kind of a tip. Now, it's not. I don't pay them personally. The company pays them, and then I bought the case of beer with my own money because I can't use my company card to purchase cases of beer, even though we live in America. But, um, so yeah, for when you go above and beyond, I see that. But I can't, I don't see tipping going away. Realistically, it just doesn't seem like it will. Now, some people think it will go away with raising the $15 an hour minimum wage. You're also going to raise the sub minimum wage, and they think it'll be cheaper for restaurant owners to pay their staff the minimum wage as opposed to the sub minimum, the new sub minimum. So that could be a change. It just feels like it's been here so long, it's going to be hard to get rid of it. And even if we do, I feel like it'll be hard to get rid of the notion that we have to tip all the time. I think even if we get rid of tipping at restaurants, it'll still be common to leave like some sort of tip, even if the tip is already included in the meal price.
Yeah, I think it's gonna take about 30 years, right? If say by 2025 we switch over to a more higher cost of objects but less tipping, I think it'll take 30 years for the mindset of the American people to stop tipping. Because I don't think tipping to me doesn't make sense. I think for once the rest of the world doesn't have it right. Because I'll be honest, Nick, tipping seems non-democratic. It's like you said. I think that it's perfect. I really like you saying it's an extra tax because that's what it is. It's literally an extra tax, and I really hope it changes, but I don't think it's going to change in this century unless automation takes it over. But I think tipping's here to stay for quite a while.
Yeah, but I think that's one of those things though, like with automation, it's kind of like COVID now, and this is different for you and me because of COVID, people were losing their jobs and businesses were struggling that I was inclined to tip more. Granted, I don't really eat out that much. And we did start eating out more during COVID, so that we were trying to spread, keep all these local businesses going. But and then we tip a little bit more. And so I wonder if it's going to be kind of the similar thing where with automation we feel obligated to tip people more because their businesses are going away. So we're trying to give them as much money to try and help them, you know?
Yeah, I guess it's like a new form of charity, I guess, almost like putting money in someone's cup. I mean, quite literally, you do that at some places, but I guess we're also scared of mom and pop shops disappearing and how much COVID's affected everyone that we're willing to pay a little extra money to keep them going through tips. But at the same time, if we pay them just a little extra money now, just in general, and we don't have to tip them, they'll probably make more money. I don't know. But before, because it occurred in my mind and I just remembered it, the word tipping or tipper has no origin. No one has any idea where it came from. Like, I don't know why that's a thing, but sorry. I just remembered it and I wanted to get it out there. But the word tipping or a tipper,
it does not mean to ensure promptness
more
or
taxation without representation.
What's the other one? Yeah. And, I don't know where. So I had another good tipping story. I was in Vegas and I was winning like a lot. I was up like $400, like, which is a lot of money for me. And my dealer was leaving, and so I tried to tip him, and it went into like the community tip jar. Like, no, I don't want to tip this new guy who I keep losing to. This other dealer I won really good with. I want to tip him. They're like, no, it all goes in the same pot. And I was like, oh, well, I just gave $20 to this random guy, or $20 to all of you fuckers, and you keep dealing me these shitty cards. It's some bullshit. So that's why I understand the people who are pissed at community tipping. Now, granted, I understand that the dealers do not choose the cards they deal, but I feel like that's a common thing in Vegas. If you're winning, you tip your dealer.
Hey, you don't mess with karma. You like if karma's doing you good, you do good by karma.
Yep. And that's a whole, what's a have you seen the recent trend lately where everyone's people, not everyone, but people are tipping like 100% on all their shit because of like COVID and all that stuff?
Nick, I don't watch the news. I just read scientific articles and books, and I don't have social media. So unless I hear it by word of mouth, or it's science slash math slash history based, I don't know about it.
I mean, I pretty much just explained it to you. People are. Long story short, it's not uncommon for people to tip like 100% or something, and it's like a big thing. And now I feel like it's just raising the expectation of tipping that all of us have to tip this insane amount. Like I'm saying that how much you tip is slowly increasing, and it feels like it's getting faster and faster, getting more momentum of tipping more and more. And it's not, and I get if you have great service and you're rich. Like what's Elvis Presley was a notoriously great tipper, but also very few people had money like Elvis Presley.
Yeah. That's honestly probably like him just throwing his loose change at that point. But yeah,
Yeah, it's like calling Rockefeller a great tipper. Like the dude burned $100 bills for warmth. Money does not mean the same to all of us.
I was gonna say, like, I remember in the early 2000s, people would like it make the local news if someone tipped $1,000 on this $30 meal. Like it was like huge deals. I'm like, why? I'll be honest, Nick. I've never had that good of a service where I wanted to tip $1,000 for a $30 meal.
That is ridiculous to me. I can't imagine. First off, having that much money that I could just give $1,000 away to one person, not like an organization that's going to help people, like to one random person. Like that's like who sings that song where oh my god, it's gonna kill me. All right, so this lady meets this guy at the bar and they get to talking and they're having a good time, and it turns out the dude was a millionaire and he left all the money to her. God is great, beer's good, and people are crazy. And I forget the chick who originally sang it, but yeah, and he just left. The millionaire had these kids, and he just left all the money to this girl, and that's a made up song, so I'm sure it's not a real thing. But it's like that. Like you just meet this random person, and the next thing you know, like your life has changed forever. I mean, $1,000 maybe won't change your life forever, but for some people it probably could. I mean, that's a lot of money just to get one day, you know? I mean, if you invest all that, you make pretty good money. But yeah, man, that's like, dropping all that. That's a lot.
Yeah, if you're able to just throw $1,000 here and there, let me hold a few for you. I would have no problem doing that.
Well, we did find that out in whatever that Gallup study of, not surprisingly, the more money you have, the higher you tip. I mean, again, there's a lot of really basic science being done around tipping right now.
Yeah, I also wonder on I never come across any studies with this. Maybe you did, but a person's upbringing on how much they tip. Like we mentioned, the North, the South, the West Coast, the East Coast. But I also imagine if you grew up poor, or like your mother was a waitress or your father was like a mechanic or something like that, where tips was actually a viable portion to your family's well-being, I imagine you might tip more then. I didn't come across any studies for this, but I imagine that's got to play an influence in it.
Yeah, I didn't see anything, but I mean that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, why wouldn't it have a difference? You just feel like you're paying it forward. You know, you see the impact it has on your family, and every time you tip, you're making that impact on another family.
I'm also very curious if people who were previously in the food service
Who served
industry,
veterans of the service industry.
Oh God, please no. I wonder if waiters are good tippers, because they might be poor, not able to tip, but they also then know exactly what the person's going through. But they might know exactly what the person's going through, and they say they've done it themselves. Why should I tip? I'm wondering if people who get tips are good tippers.
I did a quick Google search and nothing's really coming up that says that servers are good tippers.
Again, this is a kind of a
It
hard...
doesn't saying they're not.
I'm going to go with they're not, if I had to make an educated guess. Again, a guess, ladies and gentlemen. But, Nick, I don't know about you, but this was actually kind of hard to research. There's not a lot of science on tipping. It was mainly like science, like how to get more tips and people who make tips.
Yeah, pretty much. It's all about what to do to increase how much you tip. It's really weird. Like it's a surprisingly, I didn't really realize how controversial this was actually going to be until I started researching tipping. Like, and it is very controversial.
Yeah, that's completely. I completely agree. I don't understand why it's controversial, but I guess it really is.
Yeah, I don't know. But it is funny though, because I think you're right. Because my one friend who did serve, I don't think he was the best tipper. Even though he was like, you have to tip, you don't know what these people go through. He also didn't have a lot of money. He spent all his money pretty frequently, so that might be part of the problem.
I'm not gonna lie, it throws me off every time when you say he or she served. Like every time, like, how does that relate to this? What we're talking? Oh, that's right, we're talking about serving food and drinks.
Served in the service industry. For tours.
I feel like that's like a Key and Peele episode or a Dave Chappelle episode right there. I don't know.
It's active duty veteran, actually retired veteran of the service industry. 2 tours of what's the Panda one?
Express.
Panda Express. 2 tours Panda Express, 1 tour Domino's.
The cheese fields. Oh God, the cheese fields. But I don't know about you, Nick, but as like boxing or engineering based, when I see someone go through something I went through, either A, I feel sympathy because I know exactly what they're going for, or B, I don't feel sympathy, like quite the opposite. Like, oh, come on, I did that. I know exactly what you're going through. Come on. So I imagine tipping's exactly the same.
Probably. I think that's exactly right. And in my job, I supervise people who had jobs that I had previously, and it's the same thing. It's like, all right, don't bitch to me. I've been there, done that. Like, I know how bad your day is. Let's get the show on the road. Like, yeah. So I could see it where, if you're a server walking into a restaurant and it's no one's there, pretty easy day, you'd be like, are you kidding me? Like, there's nothing going on. You want me to pay this expensive tip when you're just chilling, getting money? Like, yeah, I could see it.
Well, I don't really have much on tips, except I kind of wish, like the metric system, America got on board with the rest of the world's doing. That we go, as much as I don't want, be more like other people. Like, hey, just pay the servers.
I think you're looking at this wrong, Mike. We shouldn't look at not getting rid of tipping as being more like other people. We should look at it as one less tax. I'm
down with that. I'm 100% with that. Down with that. Yeah, I found it funny in the early American history. We didn't want tips because we thought they were uncapitalistic, undemocratic, and yet we're like the last country to embrace it.
Yeah, well, someone's got to be on the losing side of history. If there's one thing as Americans are good at, it's of letting go of things.
Yeah, we don't have abandonment issues at all.
Seeing as we still have military bases all over the world.
Oh.
No, this is my part of Korea. Just kidding. The Koreans want us there.
But
anyway,
Nick, if you wanted to give a tip to the audience and they wanted to give a tip back, where could they find us on social media?
You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on YouTube.
Can they find us on Twitter?
You cannot find us on Twitter.
Because there's no good tips on Twitter. And out of curiosity, Nick, what book are you reading?
I'm kind of in between books right now. I'm kind of reading Advanced Bushcraft by Dave Canterbury,
That
which is
sounds
exactly what
oddly
it sounds.
familiar.
It's just a book about surviving in the woods for extended periods of time, which is kind of applicable because I live in the woods. I mean, I don't live in the woods, but I spend a lot of my time out in the woods. So I thought I'd give it a look-see, but it's more for if I'm going to survive out in the woods for like months at a time, and I'm cool with like a week at a time. It's like I'm not trying to build like a colony out there. So I might get like his Bushcraft 101. I don't know, but it's one of those things where I was trying to get like more involved with of knowing how to survive in the woods, but then it's like, man, I've been working out in the woods for years now, and a lot of this stuff is like kind of just like stuff you learn of what you can use for this and what you can use for that. And there's some stuff in there that is interesting to me and I really enjoyed. Don't get me wrong, but like I said, the Advanced Bushcraft by Dave Canterbury is mostly about like living for like over a week or two at a time in the woods, and I just don't think I'm gonna have to do that. So I think I may have bit off more than I cared to chew. So I might get his other book. I like the way he writes, and I like the information. It's presented in a good, interesting, easy to read way. It's just like I don't plan on living in the woods for a month, you know? I mean, I'd love to. I just don't have the time off.
Yeah, it all comes down to time and money, doesn't it?
So what are you reading?
I'm still reading Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker, and I'll be reading that for a while because I'm still in my busy season, so I get about halfway through a chapter and end up passing out and then having to reread the chapter. So I am very, very slowly marching my way through, but I am quite actually learning tidbits information on sleep because sleep is my favorite drug and my favorite vice. So it's always good to know and be able to control your vice.
Please, sir, may I have some more
That is
sleep?
that is literally me every morning. Please, just another hour, please.
I can have sleep.
Well, I hope we were informative with the tipping information, and we gave some good tips to you. Haha, da-dunch. And it is a controversial subject that is quite recently changing, and it will be changing very quickly, so we may address it again in the future. And Nick, do you have any final words?
Nope. Got nothing else to say.
Well, with that, as always, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Backyard Philosophy Podcast. We rarely finish a podcast without missing a point we wanted to bring up, so let us know what we forgot. And if you have a topic you want us to talk about, let us know at Backyard Philosophy on Instagram and Backyard Philosophy Podcast on